All right, so just there's going to be a couple of minor changes to the schedule in terms of who's doing what. We have some trickle down issues in terms of people not being able to have come here, or Amanda Brock was going to moderate this until about 15 minutes ago when her internet went bye-bye, because she, first of all, she couldn't physically come here, and now she cannot even virtually come here. So I'm going to do double duty to both moderate and talk in this one. And then we've lost another moderator. So later on, I will represent Open at RIT for the academic OSPO thing so that Mike can moderate the other thing. No, he's shaking his head. No, we've changed that. Okay, never mind. See, it's kind of an as we go kind of thing. We appreciate your patience. It's great to have Marie and Kat and Anna here. I'll go ahead and just do my piece first, but so I'm going to talk about games a little bit, and Anna and Marie have open source experience they can talk about, and Kat lives in a world between open source and science, so she gets to talk about open science a little bit as well. So games. I am old enough to remember when things like alpha tests and beta tests were things that were closed rather than the product you actually ship. And in the games community, in the AAA games community, where you're looking at these massively online multiplayer games, you will see things like product design, character design, rule sets for the game released to the player community almost immediately in the design process. We said a lot about design in our last panel. So 2 years before the game is even shipped, because these larger games that cost tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to develop and have sometimes tens of millions of players, they will in real time float ideas, as I said, characters designs, sometimes even missions within the game. And in terms of being open communities, they encourage communities of users, right? So they actively create things that cannot be achieved in a game. And those of you who play a lot of games know this, but for those of you who don't, right? So if there's like a dragon to kill, for example, that'll be designed so it takes 60, 70, 80 people to be fighting the dragon at the same time. And there will be the spontaneous creation of what the software industry would call user communities, right? You have player communities running guilds, right? These are organizations that are put together for people to play together to achieve certain goals. Sometimes they're fluid, sometimes they maintain for decades. And online gameplay at this scale can often become a regular feature of people's lives, not only individually, but together. Very early on in the World of Warcraft release and player cycle, there was a guild composed entirely of game academics, and they referred to their weekly meetings as bowling nights. That, you know, once upon a time, in the Ralph Cramden era, in the Leave It to Beaver era, right? The dads would all go out bowling, you know, Thursday night is bowling night. So this was bowling night. What? Book club. Book club is another thing. Yes, you know, that my family is fans of Malcolm in the Middle, and that brings me to the episode where the moms were in a book club where they really just got together to drink and complain about their families. So, you know, very similar, right? So these are huge goals. And in the open source community, we've seen badges for a while as one form of gamification to incent people to, on the developer side, do things. Remy DeCausemaker up there in the front row and I had a group of students one year as part of a Red Hat co-op experience, design on paper a multi-playing game where your contributions in the open source world buffed you up on your gameplay in the adventure game. We never found a funder who was willing to help us really roll with that, but if that sounds cool to anybody, let us know. We've got plenty of kids who would like to work on that. So there are communities in the open source world that don't quite have the 3 or 4 year development projection. Though Fedora, of course, is religiously known for being able to crank something out every 6 months. God bless them. But you know, what can we learn from these different communities, and how can we get best practices from one of them to translate to another one? The RIT group of students was responsible significantly for the creation of Fedora badges, and the Fedora community was very skeptical about the idea of badging programs in open source. And then I think release day, Remy, we had what, hundreds of people at Flock sign up for it? What was the number? Hundreds. So there's room here. And so we thought we'd run this panel to just talk about similarities and differences. And with that, I guess I will pass it over to Marie, who can talk about a traditional open source effort, and then we can go to Anna, who talks about an open source community of open source community drivers, and then we'll go to Kat to hear a little bit about science. Does that work for everybody?
Sure.
Okay.
So I think Badges now has like 17,000 people who have signed in at
Wow.
some point. So Fedora Badges. So I don't think Stephen needs an introduction, but I will do a quick introduction. My name is Marie Norden. I am the Fedora Project Community Action and Impact Coordinator. Very long title for community architect. And I work out of Red Hat's open source program office. The Fedora project is a Linux-based operating system. As Stephen mentioned, we release every 6 months. There's thousands of contributors worldwide to the Fedora project. So my job is to support the Fedora project in a variety of ways. I do day-to-day operation, kind of more boring stuff, if you will, like budget oversight, event planning, project management for different teams, code of conduct, incident management as well. And in the last 3 years, since I started as Fedora's F-Cake, that's the shortened version of it, there's been a couple exciting things that I was able to work on. So just as I started this role, the pandemic hit. And I thought it was going to be a travel the globe kind of job, and it did not turn out to be that. So one of the things that we had to do was move to virtual events. And I know it's been a bummer for a lot of people to move to virtual events, and it's exciting to be here in person today, but it was actually really great for the Fedora project. Flock to Fedora, that was our annual contributor conference. We got about 200 people there. The first virtual version of that, we had 350 people. The third edition of that, we've had over 1,000 people. So the growth there is just amazing. And I think my hypothesis about this is that we're bringing people who previously could not travel closer to the developers and the people who are making Fedora happen, and the people with the passion that can incite and inspire others to get involved. I've heard a lot of personal anecdotes from people about newcomers to their team saying, hey, I was at this event and now I want to contribute. So that was one really cool thing I got to work on. We also worked on revamping Fedora's outreach teams. So that includes Fedora ambassadors, the ComOps team. We have something called advocates. So reworking all that, and that was listening to the community without making excuses, with empathy, and then making changes based on that, including documentation, doing surveys, creating new art assets, meeting in different ways. So it was another really cool thing I got to work on. And the last thing I want to talk about is Fedora's Code of Conduct. So I was able to pick it up from my predecessor and revamp the Code of Conduct for Fedora. And it was a lengthy process, very lengthy. And that was with the Fedora Council, other members from the community. Red Hat Legal was involved in that. We had rounds of community feedback where we brought that back in. And then once we got that new code of conduct out, the incident reports kind of started rolling in, right? So I had a ton of experience then dealing with code of conduct incidents, which has led me to a new role at Red Hat. I am going to be moving into a community outreach related role based around code of conduct, working out of the open source program office as a code of conduct specialist. So we're going to take Fedora's work with the code of conduct and translate that to help other communities. So I think I'll stop there and pass it along.
Okay, thank you so much. So my name is Ana Jimenez, and I'm currently the To-Do program manager at To-Do Group. But my involvement in open source communities came from a long time. I initially started in Bitergia, that was a software development analytics firm, and they were highly involved in open source projects in there. Actually, their tooling was open source. So I initially didn't know anything about open source, and they were my mentors. I spent there more than 4 years, and they taught me everything I know of open source and open source communities. I pivot a lot in roles, but I think all the roles that I've had involves community management at some point. I initially started in Bitergia as a developer marketer. And in there, I get more into data science. I finished my master's degree in data science, and I focus on building a model to segment open source communities based on dev needs. I've also pivoted in the company for more consultancy, and now, as I say, I got into the group. That it's a group of organizations that practice OPSPO, open source program offices, and they get together to try to build common tooling, try to build resources, guides to help other organizations to build its open source program offices and also advance in their journey and get some kind of inspiration, inspire these organizations and how to build these more effective programs. So I like what Stephen said about I manage an open source community of open source communities, because I like a lot the idea. It's a group of people in the open source leaders that are trying to talk about and share their learnings on how to do open source. So it's been exciting, all the things we have been doing so far. I started one of my daily tasks was to grow the community, to start nurturing the community, and some of my daily jobs implies, for instance, creating onboarding guides and documentation and procedures on how to contribute to the community and to the different repos and the different programs we keep launching, and also build networking spaces so these practitioners can go there and start conversations, and also ease this network and conversations around, because this is when magic happens, is when they have ideas and they say, okay, let's work together and produce a new guide or produce a new tool that can help OSPOs to automate their processes. So that is in a nutshell what I do, what I've been doing, and what I love. And now I headed to Kat.
Do you mind if I grab the podium?
You may. Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Allman with Google. Everybody hear me okay? Good. My background in open source goes back a ways. And I'll stand away from the microphone. Mount Sinai. Anybody know what that means? A little closer. All right. Mount Sinai means Unix trademark. This was the first commercial implementation of Berkeley Unix. That's where I got started with open source back in the 1980s. Since then, I've worked with the commercialization of SendMail, but much more recently, I've been with Google for a little over 15 years, working on programs like Google Summer of Code, Google Code-In, and really fun part, giving money away to open source. That was a blast. Time moves on, and I've actually moved on to a part of the Google doing, it's called developer ecosystems. And in my case, I'm focused on something which was a 20% project for me starting in 2007, which is called Science Foo Camp, or Sci-Foo. It's an interdisciplinary, invitation-only unconference for scientists from across the disciplines and up and down the career stack. Coincidentally, good planning or not on my part, I started an alumni community the month before pandemic lockdown. We've got about 1,000 alumni of the in-person event who get together online in a Google group and talk about whatever. Now, they're super smart, which is great fun, kind of like open source people. And it's the kind of place where somebody starts talking about the mRNA vaccine, and Tom Ketch, who got his Nobel for his mRNA work, is able to drop in to clarify a couple of points, which means it's extremely diverse, extremely fun. And how is this related to open source? What the heck am I doing here? Well, part of open source is science. I mean, science happens through code. Everything's done on computers nowadays. And yes, there is still the physical component, but you take stuff back to the lab and computers. Open source, from my perspective, comes out of academia, be it UC Berkeley, the original ARPANET, what was it, 6, 8 universities. The idea of science being intrinsically involved in open source is not new. In open source, to my eye, is founded on the scientific method in the first place. So it's pretty natural that science would now be done via open source. What is arguably, and I'm sure we can have a great time arguing about this, communities within open source can be very, very different based on whether they're from a commercial perspective or from an academic perspective. Something I see in scientific projects is that they can be very small, very purpose-driven, very specific. Now, sometimes those projects will be adapted by other research labs, and then they will begin to grow. And as they grow, the community management becomes more similar to commercial projects. Actually, it's not really different than so-called free-range open source. And GitHub is filled with 1- and 2-person projects that really don't have community contributions. They were designed to solve 1 or 2 people's issues, and sometimes they maintain functionality long beyond immediate contribution. Sometimes they are abandoned and wither away and die. The same is true in the scientific community. The scientific community, though, has the additional challenge, if it's done in academia, and we can also talk about the difference between commercial science and academic science, or fundamental versus applied research, tenure brings unusual pressures to the open source community. Is code a tenure artifact in the eyes of tenure committees? From discussions earlier this morning, it seems like this is becoming the case, that in the academic world, code projects and the contributions that support that code and that contribution and project are becoming recognized as a viable artifact for tenure. But this varies dramatically from institution to institution. I suspect that it varies even more so from country to country. And I'm excited to see people here in the audience who are not from the US, who can bring their perspectives to bear. I should point out at this point that my experience of open source in science is observational rather than experiential. So my hope is in the workshop tomorrow that those of you who have participated in academic/scientific open source projects will come and contribute your lived experience of how this actually works in your institution and your project. Here's hoping. So that's me, and I look forward to carrying on the conversation with all of you today and tomorrow. Thank you.
So I wanted to throw some experiential stuff out there in terms of being a community manager within academia a little bit, and some of the challenges that we'll touch on panels following or panels that we've just had. Universities are metrics driven, right? Especially in terms of tenure. And I'm lucky that I was tenured before I began teaching students in open source and doing the stuff that I do now. Because back in the day, there were no grants, right? If you walked into a freshly scrubbed new beaming PhD student, and by the way, I don't have a PhD either, and were, given your first classes and told, all right, what's your research plan and tenure plan? And you said, oh, open source. And they would blah, ha, ha, and fall on the floor and say there are no grants in that, there's no funding in that, there's no way for you to have that career. So go find something else. Well, that is changing, which is good. Student and faculty engagement, and this is a challenge for open source programs offices in academia, it's almost impossible to track because there's three classes of people at a university. There are students, and depending on your university, their IP rights vary greatly. RIT is one of the few universities that, as long as maybe 10 years ago, said students own their own IP unless they're being paid on a grant. So at some universities, the university owns your homework, right? In my university, especially since I'm in the game department, students can roll in and use all of our software licenses and our networks and our computers to build a game, start a company, go off to monetize it, make sure they pay for their professional licenses now that they're selling the game, and they don't owe me a postcard or a thank you note. That's not the case in a lot of places. So depending on where you are, students either have no IP rights or 100% IP rights. Staff have no IP rights because they're staff, just like any employee company, right? Stating it broadly, but to be fair. Faculty are impossible to corral. Speaking as a faculty member, we do what we want to do once we've got tenure, and go ahead and give us policies and maybe we'll follow them and maybe we won't, right? So you have to adapt to all of those things. When you start a program, as I did in open source, people actually want the metrics in the way, your students, so on and so forth. The program that we established at RIT and the community that we established around it consisted of formal classes, experiential education, and co-op education, internships. A lot of that's not possible to track. The minor that we started, the provost mentioned this morning, is the only minor in open source that we're aware of in the country or the world. But the number of people who've taken 5 classes in sequence and gotten them all done before they could graduate is fairly small. It's double digits, medium-ish, maybe double digits, probably low double digits. But we have hundreds of students whose first engagement through us was open source because they came to a hackathon or they got interested in trying to get a co-op or an internship in open source, or they took a class. So I have no way to track. I know that I have students who I'm still in touch with who have careers in open source, and they follow the whole spectrum. I have students who came to get the open source minor. Some of them are in this room. I have people whose first engagement was in hackathons and never took a formal class from us and never got a co-op from us. And some of them are in this room, right? So she's doing pretty well in open source. So, you know, it's hard to find numbers, right? And I get from the open source community, I get, where are your commits? My commits are sitting in this room, but they're not snippets of code. They're not graphics. They're not interfaces and not those things. So all of these things are difficult to track. And it follows back to what's the invisible stuff that we've talked about. In terms of managing your communities, what are the hard things and what are the easy things? That's the first question. And then particularly to Kat and the audience, my observational experience is that in open science projects, the community manager role is very rare. That's changing, but it's very rare. Folks, perhaps our friends from Sloan might have some input on that as well as we open this to the floor, but those are my 2 interests. Who wants to follow up on managing their communities first?
Okay, so I will give my experience from the tutor group. So one of the challenges I facing when building new resources and new tooling is that OSPOs are quite diverse and there is no board template to build an OSPO. So when OSPO leaders try to put that into guides, is guys, you cannot say this is the way you have to build your OSPO because there is no one single answer. So one of the things we did also was to try to create several paths and see, okay, we have the guides that you can take this, and these are real examples from other organizations, and this is what worked for them, but you cannot apply it the same way they did. And also, we also, for instance, we've seen OSPOs that tries to build on common tooling to automate the process for compliance and for different, to community building and or maybe to build the IT infrastructure specific for the industry. That I've seen that in the automotive industry, for instance. And so that I will say from in the community and right now, like how can I gather all the different paths from all the different OSPOs and put them and put that in the project in the community, and also let them available for the community, and not say this is just one path, but these are all the different paths you can take, and document it and share it transparently.
So I think the question was challenges and successes, or, okay, got it. So challenges are, and it's bringing me back to that first session we had this morning, is trying to figure out how to serve the needs of the community working within Red Hat. So, you know, navigating, talking to the right people, finding who the right person is to get the thing done that I need to get done. and convincing them that it's something that needs to happen. You know, Fedora isn't front and center because they kind of operate on their own. They're a almost 20-year-old project. We're not always thought about in the business processes. So trying to work my way within Red Hat to advocate for Fedora, that's definitely a challenge. I think another challenge, which hasn't really been brought up yet today, is boundaries, burnout, putting a lot of yourself into the work. And I think during the pandemic, it kind of made it even harder. Like you could just work all day if you wanted to, or if no one was stopping you. You know, just making those boundaries and sticking to them. I think that's definitely a challenge. As far as successes go, it's the relationships that I have with the Fedora community and people in the community, the network that I've grown and the friendships that I've grown with people have really changed my life and helped me grow a lot as a human and as a professional.
I have my own. I have two stories to tell that illustrate a tension between the academic / scientific and the commercial aspects of open source community. The first one has to do with the legal side of IP. When the pandemic started, Google had an incoming class of summer interns, and we weren't in the office, so we couldn't bring them. So what are we going to do with them? Because we can't give them remote access to core systems. So instead, we found COVID-related work for most of these interns to do. And ideally, open source COVID-related work. Long story short, I'm talking with a contact at, I'll say it, the Broad Institute. And they were very keen to have help. And they told me that everything there, it's an MIT / Harvard related institute, was open source, and everything was going swimmingly until we were sent a contract, which assigned all the IP to the Broad, which came as a big surprise to the project manager because she thought that everything was open source there. But apparently their tech transfer lawyers didn't know this. Now, they were very nice about it, and everything worked out and the COVID research was done, but it illustrates how there can be a certain separation between the research side and the money side, even at the most well-funded academic institution. And open source needs to, unfortunately, navigate the translation barrier fairly often as a scientific project enters the realm of the commercial or the commercial funding. So that's one. And I had another point. Oh, Summer of Code. I've been on the selection committee for open source mentoring projects since 2007. And pretty much every year I have the same argument with another individual on this committee who is firmly of the opinion that only commercial projects count as open source, and that we shouldn't admit academic research projects to Google Summer of Code. And I believe very firmly that no, scientific project progress is important and open source is important, and these people are students, and why the heck would we not admit them? So I'm happy to say that every year I fight for biomedical projects, et cetera. But the fact that year over year for more than a decade, the same person keeps arguing with me about this. And I suspect this is not that uncommon, that there are elements within the engineering community who think that academic and science projects don't count because they don't have the potential for direct thousands of contributors, which I think is just wrong. It shouldn't be about how many people commit to your GitLab or GitHub. It should be about what the code does, what it contributes to the advancement of science or the industry or humanity. So that's my rant.
I realized I wanted to add one more thing, if that's okay. For another success, I just want to call out mentorship. Having a chance to mentor through the Outreachy program has been an amazing experience for me. I actually got involved in Fedora through an Outreachy internship doing Fedora badges design. So, full circle, 7-8 years later, I was able to start mentoring designers in the Fedora project and watching them grow and gain confidence and learn and grow that attachment to the Fedora community has been super fulfilling for me and just a joy in my life.
So a quick add what I recently explained, because I did a detailed explain on the problem, but I think I didn't summarize the challenge. So the challenge will be more like the issue of how hard it is to translate what the community wants to make, all the ideas they have, into the community, into the project, and turn it into an action that nurtures the community, that helps. Because a lot of people might have great ideas, and that is everything that comes to you, and you are like this linchpin that needs to be this translator and say, how can we put all this knowledge and put it into a program, into a new project that actually clarifies and helps the community as a whole.
So another aspect, pardon me, another aspect of all of this, and Carson spoke on it this morning, was language and linguistics and labels. And Open at RIT is not an open source programs office. The word source came out because we wanted to communicate that we're there for everybody. And we didn't want our colleagues in science or in the arts or the humanities to say, well, I'm not a software person, so this isn't for me, right? Secondarily, and with due respect to Tom Arison and the folks who are involved in the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and we spoke this morning about the 2-page document that went out to provosts and presidents. The term that they work around with, and I totally understand it, is open scholarship. We don't talk about open scholarship, we talk about open work similarly because universities are cased systems, and we're trying to fix that. And universities are still focused, though evolving, on the peer-reviewed journal that's in the top 10 of your discipline and the peer-reviewed conferences that are in the top 10. But I have colleagues, especially in the arts and in design, and some of them in the humanities, who don't believe they do scholarship because they don't put their stuff in those cubby holes. And so we talk about open work because I want my arts and humanities and all those other folks engaged. My degree is in liberal arts and in media theory. So making sure that we open to designers, to writers, to those kinds of things is very important. Where are you seeing in the sciences, Kat, or in software for the two of you, wins and challenges in trying to bring in folks who are not scientists with a capital S or software engineers with a capital S?
I'm going to jump on this one. Something where I see tremendous expansion of opportunity is in science communication, which people are really seeing as an opportunity. In some cases, it's pretty darn academic and yet strangely arty. Has everyone seen Dance Your Thesis, Dance Your PhD? It's kind of hilarious. I thoroughly recommend it. There's the global science communication competition through the Falling Walls Foundation out of Berlin, where they have people from all over the world doing all different kinds of science communication. Now, what does that have to do with open source? Well, in the sense that open source needs to be understood as having a breadth of opportunity for all kinds of people, not just computer scientists and technicians. Computer science, open source needs people to explain it to the people who aren't going to make it themselves, but are going to use it and are going to benefit from it, and should appreciate that there's opportunity and utility there for them. It feels like, I mean, when I started in open source, the term community manager didn't exist, and now it's an entire job. It's a field. I don't know, are there academic programs training people in community management, in engineering rather than in the social sciences? That would be a big no. Anyway, I like to think that that intersection of arts and creative expression, which has been made possible on a global scale by the internet and the rise of social media, will in turn amplify the opportunities for people to support engineering and the sciences through non-engineering and non-scientific work.
So I'm just gonna hit back on that mentorship topic again. I have a degree in photography and graphic design. So not really, wasn't my life path what I thought I was going to do at all. And what really cemented me falling in love with open source and Fedora was a mentor, an amazing mentor who brought me in and guided me and said, this is a place for you. You belong here. And I think that the mentorship, it's really invaluable. And I think that's one of the key ways to bring diversely abled people in, is for us who are already doing that to continue doing that. And that's why I spend my time mentoring designers. I don't mentor people in project management or program management. I spend my time mentoring designers. And that's also why in Fedora, we're going to make it a 5-year strategy goal thing for everyone to either have a mentor or be mentoring someone. That's like the stretch, that's the stretch goal for sure. But we want to, to instill that culture of mentorship into our project to make it more sustainable and to diversify the roles that we see.
One of the resources that in the Todo community we are working at, it's education. And we have 101 training guides and OSPOs, and our desire, the community desire, is to expand that. And why I'm saying this, a lot of people in the OSPO had issues when trying to share the value and how to engage in open source with teams that doesn't come from IT and development. Open source, it's needs to entail the whole organization and in the industry field, and you need to convince legal, you need to convince marketing, and you need to infuse the whole organization with a clear understanding of open source. So at that point, having this education and educate marketers, educate designers, educate legal people into open source. They doesn't need to know about code. They don't need to be developers, but they need to know how to get involved in open source communities and how to contribute back to open source communities. So that is a main challenge in the same organization within teams. One sort of story about me, my first degree was marketing. And then I get into a lot of coding and stuff. I started to build websites, and then I got into Python. So this is a different point of view, because I did learn code, but what I learned was that you don't need to learn code to get into open source. And also for my marketer colleagues that I had, I always tell them like how awesome is open source and the need of more marketers into open source communities and open source projects, and how they can get involved without knowing to program and do coding and so on. And they still really cautious on that. And I think this mindset needs to be changed. And we can only do that thanks to education and mentorship.
Yeah, and just, Solona spoke this morning about role diversity, and whether it's open science or open research or open scholarship or open source software, role diversity leads to other diversity. You see it in the attendees and the presenters here, that by providing role diversity, you get a bigger tent. What's my time, Mike? 2 minutes. Who's got a really quick question, or should we just let you take a bio break 2 minutes earlier? A hand in the back, Zach.
So it seemed to me that a common theme is about relationships that are built. What's your commit? It's not code. It's the people in this room. It's the lives that have been impacted. For you is the opportunity to mentor and your mentor, and hearing kind of as you're talking about education and everything, and for Kat, building this alumni program and so on. So I'm curious for you, Kat, how do you track your metrics of your community, and how do you share the stories that are those like invisible stories of those relationships?
Well, frankly, I've been kind of cheating this whole time because it's an invitation-only conference, and somebody earlier mentioned trying to fly under the radar to get your program established. Initially, Larry Page was the one that wanted us to do this, which made it super easy to do because no one was going to tell the CEO, no, we're not going to do this. Larry obviously is no longer the CEO, and so I need to find executive support without attracting attention from marketing. Because if anybody quotes me, I'm a dead woman, so please, nobody. In terms of tracking metrics, again, because of executive sponsorship, it has been pretty airy-fairy, but I do keep a record of companies that have been started. Luckily, one of them has been very successful and Google buys services from them. Research collaborations, funding for research from one attendee to another. Obviously, I track not just who is a member of the alumni network, but how many Nobel Prize winners are in the alumni network, because people love them a Nobel. But luckily, it has been very anecdotal to this point and very quiet. I encourage people to talk to each other and build it basically on the basis of friendship, because I think it was Bill Joy who said business gets done on the basis of people who like each other. Now, obviously, that's not entirely all there is to it, but it helps a lot. So ask me next year if I get funding for my budget. We'll see.
So this year we had our first Fedora Mentor Summit. So we have some metrics from who attended, who spoke, and we'd love to see growth at that next year. Hopefully that will happen. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, brought up a couple times, badges, and some of those are awarded for mentorship. So we have package sponsors, we have ambassador mentors. So you would earn those badges for respectively mentoring. We also have one for outreachy, and we were involved in GSOC a couple times. So that's yet another way that we measure that in Fedora.
From our community, we have basic metrics, and it's more for the community participation. I mean, basic numbers and how engaged they are. Like, are they just submitting issues, or are they actually contributing and submitting pull requests, or how many reviewers do we have, and how the different repos have activities? Like, these are really typical open source projects metrics, nothing special.
Okay, we're out of time. We'll let you stretch your legs and come back and hear about academic hospitals.